Hey guys, tonight we begin with the silent whispers of a forgotten land, a place of paper walls, flickering lanterns, and secrets kept beneath silk. A place where even the wind seems polite, where footsteps fall like snowflakes on polished wood, and where silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Tonight, we travel to ancient Japan, but not to follow emperors, conquests, or shoguns. No, we won't be naming battles or dates. Instead, we'll drift through scenes of daily life, like the scent of pine smoke hurling from a village hearth. We'll sit with the old woman who rinses rice in cold river water. We'll kneel beside a monk who hasn't spoken in weeks. We'll watch a samurai gently clean his blade not from blood, but from time. This journey isn't one of noise or grandeur. It's a soft unraveling of centuries, felt through worn sandals and sleeping mats, through calligraphy strokes and tea that cools before it's sipped. There's no need to hurry. This story has waited over 1,000 years to be told. It will wait a little longer for you to settle in. We'll feel the winter wind slip through bamboo slats. We'll hear the hush of breath during a tea ceremony. We'll witness the quiet ache of a mother folding her son's robes after he leaves for battle, not knowing if he'll ever return. The beauty of ancient Japan wasn't in its wars. It was in the way it survived them. Through rituals, through art, through the stillness between moments. From the frost-covered shores of Hokkaido to the spring petals falling over Kyoto's temples, we'll follow the poetry of survival, one silent footstep at a time. So settle in and let your breath slow, because our story begins not in war, but in stillness. Long before swords were forged or emperors bowed beneath painted ceilings, there was only earth, damp, untamed, and humming with unseen spirits. This was Japan before it knew it was Japan, when mountains had no names and rivers had only memories. The forest canopy swayed like an old lullaby. Pines leaned into one another, gossiping in the wind. Beneath their branches, small fires flickered in dugout homes, half-buried pits with roofs of thatch and woven bark. Inside, the people moved slowly, not out of laziness, but because they understood something we've forgotten, that life, in its quietest form, is already full. They didn't have a word for history. Not yet. But they carved spirals into clay, letting the fire speak for them. Their pots were crude, coiled things, not meant to impress, just to endure. Smoke clung to their fingertips. Ash gathered in the folds of their clothes. No one minded. Filth was warmth, and warmth was survival. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Outside, the world was patient. Seasons weren't something to mark. They were something to listen to. Spring crept in quietly, with buds so small you had to kneel to see them. Summer brought fish darting through streams, the thrill of a full net, the hush of gratitude spoken into open palms. Autumn smelled of wet bark and smoked meat. Winter? Winter didn't ask for permission. It arrived with teeth. But even then, in those long snow-wrapped nights, they did not curse the cold. They made peace with it, dug deeper, wove tighter, learned how to trap heat with straw, and how to find joy in steam rising from a pot. Of roots and fish bones, they pressed close. They shared stories, not to entertain, but to remember. To stitch their days together with sound. No one wrote anything down. Words weren't trapped in ink yet, but they were passed between mouths and hands in lullabies, in the scrape of a bone knife, in the way a mother smoothed her child's hair before sleep. Memory was breath, and breath was sacred. Sometimes they danced, not in celebration, but in mimicry. They watched the birds and copied their grace. They watched the deer and learned how to move without sound. Their dances were offerings, not performances. Each stomp of the foot echoed into the soil, asking only for another season. Another day, and they watched the sky, not because they needed answers, but because it made them feel small. And being small, back then, was safe. To disappear into the trees was to be protected. To live without being noticed was to live longer. They believed everything had a spirit. The wind, the stones, the dead leaves beneath their beds. If something was heavy, it had meaning. If something broke, it had spoken. There was no such thing as silence, only the sounds they hadn't learned to understand yet. Children were born into this, not with celebration, but with acceptance. Their first cries were met with firelight and calloused hands. No midwife's cry of joy, no written name, just warmth, milk, and the slow rhythm of a lullaby passed down since the forest first opened its arms. They had no shrines, only certain trees that seemed to listen, rocks that never moved, even during floods, places where moss grew thick and time stood still. They didn't pray for fortune. They whispered thanks for rain, for marrow, for the quiet joy of waking up one more day beside the fire. There were no wars yet, not real ones. Disagreements, yes. Hunger always sharpened tempers. But the earth was still wide enough for walking away. You didn't fight your neighbor. You just moved your fire a little further into the trees. Solitude was not a punishment. It was a second chance. When someone died, there were no tombs. Just a bundle, wrapped in bark or fur, placed beneath the roots of something older. The dead weren't sent away. They were given back, returned to the place that had loaned them breath in the first place. And so, a land held them, these nameless ones. The ones who shaped nothing grand, but everything lasting. Who left behind no castles, but the soul of a people. They are in the curves of every rice bowl, in the hush that still lives in mountain mist, in the feeling you get, even now, walking beneath a cedar too wide to embrace. This was the land before names, before history had teeth, when survival was its own kind of poetry, and to live simply was the highest wisdom. And that brings us to something deeper still, the breath of the ancestors, and the quiet gods they whispered to in the leaves. They didn't speak to gods in temples. Not yet, not in marble halls or underpainted ceilings. They spoke to gods in the wind, in the steam rising from a hot bowl of rice, in the hush of a forest clearing where no birds sang, and even the foxes held their breath. In ancient Japan, before prayer was written and rituals were choreographed, there was something older, not a religion, a rhythm, a way of being that felt the sacred in everything. This was the world of kami, not gods in the way we think of them, but essences, presences, a quiet awareness in all things, a pebble that had never moved in generations, a tree that seemed to tilt its head to listen, a breeze that circled a hut and left without disturbing the fire. The people felt these things. They bowed not to worship, but to acknowledge. They didn't build shrines because they wanted to be seen. They built shrines because they noticed. They were already being watched. There were no rules, only awareness. If the rice sprouted early, you thanked the spirit of the water. If the fire didn't catch, you apologized to the wood. If a child grew strong, you gave quiet thanks to the he, unseen. And if something went wrong, a storm, a sickness, you didn't blame. You asked, what did we forget to respect? Kami were not distant. They were not loud. They didn't demand. They waited. And they whispered. To live among them was to live gently. You learned to sweep your doorstep not just to clean it, but to greet the morning. You poured out the first sip of sake, not to waste it, but to share it with what you could not see. You left coins by a stone that never moved, a ribbon on a branch that had never bloomed. You honored the quiet dot in this world. Nothing was thrown away thoughtlessly. Even broken tools were thanked before being discarded. A knife, chipped and dulled, was wrapped in cloth before being buried in the earth. It served, they would say. It remembered our hands. The ancestors lived on, not as memories, but as breath. They weren't mourned loudly. They were honored in the way the kettle boiled, in the way vegetables were sliced with precision, in the way one bowed to the kitchen before eating. Because ancestors didn't leave. They watched from rafters, from shadows, from the steam on a mirror after morning water was splashed on a sleepy face. When someone passed, there was grief, of course, but not panic. The dead became part of the cycle. A grandmother who once combed her hair slowly by the window might now live in the plum tree she once watered. A father who never raised his voice might now be the hush in the evening breeze that cooled a tired family. Even the act of breathing, the slow in and out of lungs softened by rice wine and charcoal air, was sacred. To breathe was to remember. And when one no longer breathed, they were not gone. They were simply given back to the invisible, returned to the rhythm. Children were taught to greet the morning sun with a bow, not because it was required, but because it felt right. They bowed to rivers before crossing. They placed small stones at the base of large trees, as if saying, "You are older than us. Please let us pass." No one taught these things in schools. They were absorbed, like warmth into skin, like steam into straw walls, through repetition, through watching elders, through silence. Even illness was met with a kind of reverence. Not welcome, but not scorned. Thebedy had its ways of speaking, they believed. And pain often carried a message from the old world, from a kami upset or a lesson ignored. So they wrapped the sick gently, lit incense, whispered apologies, not to gods, to the illness itself. Some days, an entire village might pause for a sudden wind. No words spoken, just a collective stillness. Because sometimes the kami were passing through, and to ignore them would be like ignoring a bowed elder. Unthinkable dot at night, when fires dimmed and sandals were lined neatly at the edge of the sleeping mats. The people of ancient Japan didn't pray for riches. They whispered thanks for the warmth of the hearth, for the sound of crickets in the distance, for another day not taken for granted. And in that quiet gratitude, that daily rhythm of acknowledgement, the ancestors breathed with them, not as ghosts, not as deities, but as presence, as warmth in the tatami mats, as the sudden calm that comes when you stop speaking and just listen. This was their faith, not shouted, not sung, but lived, in every bow, every sip, every breath. Just as breath flows from chest to chest in silence, so too did this reverence carry on, passed from grandmothers to grandchildren, not through doctrine, but through dust and hands and habit. And so the people moved gently through the centuries, always watched, always watching, not afraid, just aware of the breath that surrounded them, the breath they came from, the breath they would return to. No one ever saw the kami, but everyone knew they were there, in the way the bamboo leaned, in the way the soup simmered, in the way a crow landed once, looked, and left. And that brings us to the next thing they noticed. The stories they shaped without words, in clay, in fire, in spirals that spoke long before ink ever did, before scrolls were unrolled in candlelight, before words were brushed in black ink across rice paper. There were spirals in clay, silent fingerprints left in soft earth, shaped by hands that didn't know they were making history, only that they were making something warm, something useful, something beautiful. The people didn't speak much back then, not with voices. They spoke with touch, with shape, with fire, The first pot wasn't made for art. It was made to hold water, to boil fish bones, to store seeds against a winter that would not forgive forgetfulness. But as the hands worked, something changed. A flick of the thumb added a twist. A coil curved into a spiral. A jagged line etched by a sharp shell. And suddenly, necessity had bloomed into something more. Something like memory. The pottery of ancient Japan, what we now call jomen, was not smooth. It was textured, coiled, wrapped in the chaos of creation. It looked like it had something to say. And maybe it did. Because long before language settled into symbols, these pots were speaking. They spoke of hunger, with wide mouths and deep bellies. They spoke of fire, their charred undersides kissed by countless hearths. They spoke of family, passed down, patched, carried. They were not decorations. They were lives, baked into form. Each pot was different. Some small enough for herbs, others so large 2 people had to lift them. No 2 alike, just as no 2 winters were. Some were decorated with rope, others scratched with bones. All of them carried stories in a language only fire could understand. Even the act of making one was sacred. Clay was not taken casually. It was found slowly, dug from riverbeds, heavy with yesterday's rain. And before shaping it, the people would often pause, not to pray, but to notice. The way the earth clung to their fingers. The way it yielded, then resisted, then yielded again. Forming clay was a conversation, and fire was the final word. The kill was nothing grand. Just a pit, sometimes lined with stones, other times nothing more than a mound of dirt and ash. But inside it, time folded. Hours passed. Night fell. Sparks danced against a sky that had no name for stars. And by morning, something new had been born. Hard, fragile, and alive in its own quiet way. These pots weren't stored away. They lived among the people, sitting by the fire, hanging from beams, cracked and remended, cupped in hands that remembered their weight. They were washed in rivers and dried in wind, whispered over, sometimes cried into. They held more than food. They held comfort. And when one finally broke beyond repair, it was not thrown aside. It was buried. With the quiet respect usually reserved for something with breath. Because in a way, the pots did breathe. Through steam, through warmth, through memory. Sometimes a pot would be placed beside the dead, not as an offering, but as a companion. Something to hold time with them in the dark. A shape to remember. A hand. A curve to echo a face. Children grew up tracing the grooves with their fingers, learning not just to shape, but to feel. To understand that a smooth surface wasn't always better. That imperfection carried history. That a scar in clay was a lesson, not a flaw. Mothers taught daughters how to balance the weight. Fathers showed sons how to center the coil, but always quietly, not with rules. With rhythm, pottery was a lullaby made solid. It sang of days spent, mealing by rivers, of smoke-stained fingernails, of rice slowly swelling in the bottom of a pot, while wind rattled the door. And when the world outside was too loud, when rain screamed on rooftops or wolves howled on the mountain, a pot on the fire was a promise. You were still here. You were still warm. Some were shaped with animal faces, some with horns or eyes or symbols we still don't fully understand. But maybe understanding wasn't the point. Maybe the point was the silence they filled, the connection they bridged, from hand to fire, from hunger to hope. Because in a world without scrolls or stamps or ink, a pot was proof. Proof that someone had survived the winter, that someone had loved enough to feed, that someone had cared enough to create. Even now, thousands of years later, these vessels are unearthed whole, waiting, the grooves still catching light, the soot still clinging in shadows. as if time had passed over them gently, afraid to smudge. The memory dot you can almost imagine the hands that made them. A mother, her child strapped to her back. A man with bad knees, shaping clay to keep busy through the snow. A teenager trying, failing, and trying again. They didn't know their pots would last this long. They only knew that they needed them. Now. And that was enough dot, and that brings us to a moment when need became something greater, when rice arrived, and the land itself began to change. When the hum of clay gave way to the rush of water through canals, and the quiet pulse of civilization began to form. The land had always given roots, fish, bark, berries, but never evenly. Some years gave plenty. Others took everything. Back, and in those lean seasons, people did not cry out. They simply endured, quietly, thinly, together. Rice came, not all at once, not as a sudden bounty or miracle. It came like most revolutions do in Japan, softly, respectfully, as if bowing before it entered. A seed tucked into damp earth. A promise hidden in mud dot, and for the first time, the people realized food could be shaped, grown, multiplied, controlled. The earth no longer had to be asked for permission. It could be invited, prepared, persuaded. The fields changed first. Where? Once there had been scrub grass and wild weeds. Now there were squares of mirrored sky, paddies, still water. Rows so perfect they felt like prayer. In the early mornings, mist hovered above them, veiling the ground like a secret. And beneath that veil, the green tips of rice plants reached upward, slowly, steadily, stubbornly. Work changed too. Body bent in new ways, not to gather, but to plant. Not to forage, but to tend. Backbreaking, repetitive, mud-slick work. But there was rhythm in it, a new kind of ritual. One that whispered, if you do this well, the cold won't find you. Empty dot, and so they did it well. Families woke before the sun. Children carried baskets. Elders watched for the first signs of pests or rot. Every hand had a part to play. No task was beneath anyone, because rice did not care who planted it, only that it was respected. Villages began to hum with new purpose. Where once there had been drifting, now there was direction. Storage pits were dug deeper. Roofs were reinforced. And over time, even houses shifted, built near the fields, facing the east, watching for that first slant of golden morning light on water dot. With rice came rhythm. With rhythm came time. With time came planning. And with planning came power dot. Not all power is loud. Some of it grows silently beneath the surface, like roots. The one with the most grain stored after winter was the one others began to follow. Deference grew where dependence took root. And so, class was born, but the people didn't speak of that yet. They only knew that some had more, and those who had more built higher, ate first, slept warmer, but even then, among those who owned, less, there was pride. A shared bowl of rice was never pitied. It was sacred. The clatter of chopsticks, the steam rising from the pot, the soft crackle of toasted grains at the bottom. All of it was ceremony dot in the coldest months, when winds clawed at the shutters, and snow bent the trees. The warmth of rice could be felt in the belly long after it was gone. And if there wasn't enough, you took a little and gave the rest. You told your hunger to wait. Some things were still the same. Children still played in the puddles. Lovers still whispered beneath the eaves. But now there was the scent of damp straw mats and stored grain. There was the weight of harvest on every shoulder. A quiet pressure to be ready, to not fail the field. Even the songs changed. Women sang while planting, not loudly, but in low, steady tones, rhythmic, repetitive. Words that passed time without drawing attention. A way to stay upright, to keep going, to remember the body even as it disappeared. Into labor, the seasons became teachers. Spring was the rush, the planting, the weeding, the waiting. Summer brought heat and hope, and fingers dipped into the water to feel its depth. Autumn was the great relief, the slicing, the gathering, the stacking of sheaves like golden prayers. And winter was the judgment. Did you prepare enough? Did you listen to the earth? Did you take more than you gave? Rice held the answers. It never lied in time. People began to wear their labor, the smell of chaff in their sleeves, the calluses on their palms, the dark lines of sun around their necks. There was no shame in it, only truth. Their lives were inscribed not in books, but on their skin, their tools, their silence. And slowly, very slowly, the people became rice. Not literally, but in the way they bent and stood again. In the way they flooded and receded. In the way they demanded nothing but offered everything. Rice was more than food. It was structure. It was future. It was identity. Even now, when the field is empty and the sun is low, some say you can still hear it. The shuffle of feet in incandescent. Water, the soft thud of mud falling from a tool. The low murmur of a song meant for no one in particular. Because once rice entered the land was never quiet again. And that brings us to a place where power no longer whispered, but dressed itself in silk and silence, where emperors walked unseen, and where the burden of being divine settled heavily upon mortal shoulders. The palace did not shout. It did not glitter. It did not rise like a fortress above the land. It whispered. Tucked behind sliding screens and shaded gardens, the seat of power in ancient Japan preferred silence over spectacle. Its walls were made of paper. Its weight of myth. To be emperor was not to command. It was to endure. He rose early, but not from urgency. He was bathed, clothed, painted, and bowed too, not because he asked, but because the story required it. A living god, they called him. A bridge between heaven and earth. But gods, it turned out, still got cold. Still watched the rain fall sideways across the courtyard. Still lay awake at night, listening for footsteps that never came. He was never alone, and yet always alone. Because when you are myth, people stop speaking to the man and begin performing for the symbol. They bow lower, speak slower, eyes averted, words rehearsed. A father becomes a title, a son, a ceremony. And somewhere, in the soft folds of brocade and incense smoke, the human begins to vanish. His meals arrived in quiet procession. Lacquered trays, delicate porcelain, steam curling like unanswered questions. He ate what was permitted, spoke only when tradition allowed, laughed when he dared into a sleeve. There were women, of course, many, not lovers, but arrangements. They came cloaked in elegance, voices like wind chimes, hands that had never touched soil. Some offered poetry, some offered lineage. All were told to look up only when spoken to. The emperor listened to them speak of moonlight and plum blossoms, but rarely of themselves. No one asked what he feared, or what he remembered, or if, in the quiet between rituals, he missed being called by his name. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right outside the palace. The country shifted. Rice flowed through canals. Lords sharpened ambition. Monks debated the soul's direction. But inside, time moved in circles. Seasons were tracked by the scent of flowers placed daily in a porcelain vase, by the color of robes, by the angle of sun through reed blinds. The emperor wrote poetry, not declarations, just fragments about the way dew clung to bamboo, the sadness of falling leaves, The ache of a distant flute at night. Because a man with no right to complaint must become a master of metaphor. He watched the world through slits in screens. Not hidden, veiled, a ruler who never ruled, only reigned. Because real power had already slipped from his fingers and pooled into the hands of others, generals, advisors, monks with sharper tongues than swords. And yet, they still bowed, still chanted his lineage, still whispered his name as if it carried thunder. He was both center and shadow. On festival days, he wore 12 layers of silk, each color chosen to mirror the season, each fold weighted with expectation. The garments were so heavy, attendants sometimes had to support him as he walked, but no one ever spoke of it. Because gods do not stumble. When he sat beneath the cherry blossoms, petals drifting onto his lap, he did not smile. He held still, as if carved from the same stone the palace paths were paved with. Behind him, ladies in waiting held fans to shade his gaze. Before him, musicians played songs written long before he was born. He listened, not to the music, but to the silence between notes. In that silence, there was truth. He was tired, but he could never say so. He was afraid, but only in the privacy of dreams. He was human, but remembered only as divine. And when he died, there were no wails, just a change in titles, new robes. Another name added to a scroll. His body, cleansed, perfumed, sealed in layers. His face, not painted in grief, but in perfection. His absence filled immediately by another presence. Another man told he was no longer a man, and so it went, one after another. Each emperor raised in a cradle of reverence, buried beneath the same quiet weight. The palace remained, unmoved, unchanged, uncaring, a place where men became myths, and myths became lonely. But beyond the gates, in the shaded alleys, behind modest walls, life had its own rhythm. Courtiers exchanged glances behind fans. Women wept softly behind curtains. And poetry, always poetry, flowed like lantern light across water. Because even in a world where gods walked, it was the mortals who remembered what it meant to ache. And that brings us to the quietest halls of all, not of emperors, but of courtiers, where power whispered through folded letters, and love hid behind paper screens in verses written by candlelight. The palace gardens did not bloom by accident. Each petal was chosen, each pond stone turned by careful hands. And among these calculated blossoms, courtiers glided like ghosts in silk, quiet, measured, watching everything, revealing nothing. This was Hygiene, Japan, a world of stillness and subtlety, where power didn't shout. It murmured behind folding fans, in glances held a moment too long, and in poems slipped beneath sliding doors. In these courtyards, status was delicate. A single word could elevate. A misplaced syllable could destroy. They dressed not to impress, but to suggest. 12 layers of color, each with meaning, each saying what the mouth must not. Autumnal reds meant longing. Pale greens meant hope. Wistful indigo, silence. Even. Walking was performance. To move too quickly was to betray impatience. To stumble, unthinkable. So they floated, feet hidden beneath silk hems, their presence marked by the scent of incense trailing behind. Conversation rarely began with names. First came the season, then the weather, then a line of poetry. Only then, and only if the mood allowed, might a thought be offered, not declared, not insisted, merely placed like a blossom on water, to see if it would drift toward another heart. They called it miyabi, elegance, but not the loud elegance of jewels or crowns. It was the elegance of restraint, of knowing when not to speak, when to sigh instead of cry, when to fold a letter and let it answer for you. And they wrote. Oh, how they wrote. Not essays or declarations, but poems. short, fragile. A world wrapped in 5 lines. A woman might write to a lover who never returned. Your footsteps faded before the dew had dried. Still I wait and wait. And he, days later, might reply, if the dew lingers, it is not because I stayed, only the wind stalled. It wasn't flirtation. It was survival. To be remembered was to remain. To be unread was to disappear. In these paper-walled palaces, emotion became ink. And ink became armor. No swords were drawn here. But reputations bled quietly. A miswritten poem could haunt a career. A compliment too early, scandal. A silence too long, suspicion. Love was never simple. There were no public embraces. Just shared glances during cherry blossom viewings. A brief brush of hands as sleeves passed in a hallway. A poem tucked into a bouquet of plum blossoms. And if you were lucky, a reply. Sometimes not even that. Some lovers never spoke. They exchanged thoughts through messengers. Letters delivered. At night, their scent revealing more than the words. And if a man was bold enough to visit in person, he left before dawn. Always. To be caught was to be undone. Yet they still dared, because to feel was human, and to feel secretly, divinely, human. In these quiet halls, jealousy wore perfume. Ambition wore poetry. Loneliness, the soft rustle of robes in the night. The most powerful women had no titles, only presence, only the ability to make others feel small, with a look, a line, a laugh that ended too soon. The most dangerous men were not warriors. They were scribes, who knew how to destroy without raising their voice. And through it all, the gardens bloomed. Year after year, petals fell like old regrets. Water rippled with secrets no one dared name. Even time felt different here. Clocks didn't chime. Days passed with the movement of shadows, with the changing scent of incense, with the arrival of a new poem. Sometimes a single letter could change everything. A nobleman exiled, a woman dismissed, a reputation cracked like porcelain. No war was needed, just a whisper, a poem left open on the wrong desk, a feeling too clearly stated. But even in this fragile world, or perhaps because of it, beauty thrived. They knew the cherry blossoms would not last, that incense faded, that even the most perfect letter yellowed with age. And so they cherished the moment, the now, the almost, a poem read by lantern light, a koi fish turning once in the pond, the sound of a flute drifting from a distant room. These were the treasures. Not gold, not crowns, but moments. Brief, delicate, human. Because behind every whisper was a heart. Behind every mask, a soul aching to be seen. And so they wrote, and waited, and watched. Not for war, but for recognition. For someone to reply, not with power, but with presence, not with command, but with understanding. And that brings us to those who are not born to elegance, but who found their own rhythm between ink and iron, the warrior poets, who lived by the blade and by the brush, and who believed that to die beautifully was to live completely. He rose before the light touched the edges of the thatched roof, before birds called, before rice steamed. There was a silence he liked before morning, a kind that held no expectations. Only breath, only stillness. The samurai did not rush. His rituals began in quiet. He dressed slowly, not for display, but for focus. One layer, then another. Cotton, linen, armor. His sword lay beside him, waiting. Not hungry, not proud, just there. Like breath, he bowed to it, because a sword was not a weapon. It was a mirror, and to carry one was not to promise violence, but to carry the weight of one's own reflection. They were not born warriors, not in the way tales suggest. They were born as sons, as brothers, as boys who watched their fathers train in the mud, who learned to clean a blade before they could read, who were told softly but firmly, "You will not flinch." And they didn't, not when their shoulders ached, not when the winters bit through the cracks in the walls, not when fear made their mouths dry. To flinch was to betray the body, to betray the code, Bushdo, the way of the warrior. Not a commandment, but a path, narrow, lonely, steep, lined not with trophies, but with self-denial. Honor was not something you claimed. It was something others saw in the way you held silence, in the way you lowered your eyes, in the way you sheathed your sword more often than you drew it. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. They practiced not to kill, but to control the arc of a strike, the weight of a stance, the moment just before movement. It was never about speed. It was about stillness before the storm. And they wrote. Yes, warriors wrote. Poetry, mostly. Short, aching verses about impermanence, about falling leaves, about the moonlight on a blade before dawn. Because the samurai knew better than anyone. Everything passes. Beauty fades. And so does life. A man might ride for days to see a cherry tree bloom once, might compose a haiku before a duel, might carry a letter from his child tucked beneath his armor, never read aloud, but touched each night before sleep. They weren't cruel. They were careful. They kept their feelings behind masks of composure, but they felt deeply. They felt the weight of duty, of love, of absence. A samurai bowed to his mother longer than to his lord. He knew who had shaped him first, who had stayed up during fevered nights, who had packed his things the morning he left, silently, bravely, as all mothers do. They walked without music, but the world made its own, the creak of leather, the soft ring of metal against scabbard, the gravel beneath their sandals. Some days they fought, but not always for glory, sometimes for land, sometimes for their lord, sometimes just because someone else told them to. But when they fought, it was clean, precise, not showy, a single movement. Then stillness. And if they died, they did not cry out. They tried always to fall with grace, to fall like a leaf, not a storm. Those who lived returned to their homes like ghosts, quiet, eyes distant, not because they were heartless, but because the heart needed time to return. They sat by the hearth, listened to the sound of their children breathing, tended to their swords as if washing away memory. And in the quiet days between battles, they taught their sons to bow before speaking, taught their daughters to fold letters like prayers, taught themselves to live not for victory, but for balance. Because war was a disruption. But peace was the real test. Could you be kind after you had seen death? Could you write beauty after carrying pain? Could you hold a child's hand without fear of breaking it? Some could. Some never returned from battle, even if their body did. Some sat in gardens at sunset, watching the sky, wondering how it was always so calm, so unaffected. They rarely spoke of what they'd done, only what they had learned. And that, perhaps, was the legacy. Not the battles won, not the armor passed down, but the silence, the stillness, the ink, a poem, a sword, a life lived in tension between the two. And that brings us to a different kind of endurance, not of blood or honor, but of snow, of smoke, of survival through the coldest nights, when families pressed close on tatami floors, and warmth became a quiet act of defiance. The snow didn't arrive with fury. It crept, softly, silently, brushing over rooftops, slipping through the bamboo, settling in the folds of life like a second silence. It coated the fields first, then the trees, then the pathways, until the village vanished beneath a hush of white. In ancient Japan, winter was not a season. It was a trial. The house was not made to hold out the cold. Its walls were paper. Its floors were wood. The wind came in anyway, always polite, always biting. And so the people adapted. They didn't try to banish the cold. They learned how to live beside it. They laid tatami mats, thick woven straw, soft underfoot, but never warm on there. Beneath them, the earth remained hard, and sometimes, when the frost was deep enough, a whisper of it would rise through the floorboards. You could feel it in your ankles, in your ribs, in your breath. Fire became sacred, but not fire like we know it, bold and sprawling. No, it came in braziers, small iron pots of smoldering charcoal. They glowed more than they burned. Placed at the center of the room like a quiet heartbeat, people sat around it, close, closer, until knees touched and sleeves brushed dot. No one spoke loudly. The heat was a gift, and loudness felt like arrogance. Meals were simple bowls of rice, miso broth, salted fish curled like kamas in the dish. The steam from the food mattered almost as much as the food itself. To eat was to thaw. From the inside out, children learned quickly where to sit, where the draft came in, how to tuck their feet beneath their mother's robe when the wind got too bold. Laughter still happened, always, even in the cold, but it came in bursts, like sparks, then faded again into the hush of winter. Blankets were layers of woven cotton, sometimes stuffed with wadding, but never thick. There were no heaters, no wool, no insulation, save for the bodies themselves. And so they slept together, not out of romance, but necessity. A mother would press her back to the wall, a father on the other side, children in between, like kindling, warmed by breath, by skin, by the shared dream of making it to spring. They said you could measure a night's cold by how close people slept. And some nights they became one single shape beneath the bedding, a shape that breathed, the wind outside, sang through bamboo slats. It didn't ask permission. It found every gap, but they did not curse it. They adjusted. Doors were stuffed with old cloth, windows covered with straw. Cracks in the walls were plugged with paper dipped in ash paste, and in the morning they'd wake with frost on the inside of their walls, their breath visible, their fingers stiff. But they were here, still, together. If someone fell ill, the brazier was moved closer. The soup was ladled thicker. The prayers, though unspoken, thickened in the air. There were stories told, always, not just to pass time, but to pass warmth, of fox spirits lost in snowstorms, of monks who slept beneath trees and never woke, of brave travelers who left in winter and returned in spring with tailies and frostbite and lessons that winter was memory. It marked people, the scar on a toe from a frostbitten night, the way a father's hands never fully thawed again, the soup recipe that only came out when the snow did. And somehow, it was beautiful. The snow, when it fell, turned even the poorest home into poetry. A broken roof became a sculpture, a crooked fence, a line of calligraphy. The world slowed, and with it, so did people. They made space for small joys, the crackle of wood, the slow pouring of tea, the hiss of rice on a hot pan, the silence after a child stopped crying and began to sleep. They did not expect comfort. They created it, wove it into the folds of robes, pressed it into shared meals, built it with their backs, their hands, their stubborn hope. And still, they swept their porches each morning, even if snow fell again by noon, because it mattered to greet the day, to shape it, however briefly, to say, we are still here, we are still living. Some days they ventured, Out, wrapped in layers, eyes narrowed against the wind, they stepped carefully. To gather wood, to fetch water, to check on an elder, to leave offerings at a shrine half buried in snow. They bowed to the cold, not in surrender, in respect. It had come, as it always did. And so had they Dot. And when spring came, because it always did, the snow didn't melt all at once. It withdrew, quietly, respectfully, like a guest who had stayed too long, but left the house cleaner than expected. Underneath, they found life again. Shoots of green, mats to be aired, children running barefoot through puddles. But they did not forget the cold Dot. It had shaped them, reminded them. That warmth was not found. It was made. And that brings us to a different kind of warmth, not of bodies, but of spirit. A ritual born not from hunger, but from silence. A ceremony not of fire, but of boiling water, shared glances, and peace. Dot. It begins with water. Always, drawn carefully, heated slowly, not to a rolling boil, that would be too loud, just to the point where the bubbles begin to sigh. The tea ceremony was not created to impress. It was born in a world already noisy, even in its quiet. It was a rebellion in stillness, a declaration that peace too could be practiced. Called it Shanoyu, but it wasn't just tea. It was attention, a lesson in presence, a way of folding the world into a single room, a single bowl, a single breath. There were no grand halls for this ritual. No marble, no throne, just a small tea room, often no bigger than a shed, its doorway deliberately low, so that even a warrior had to bow to enter. Dot. Inside, simplicity. Walls of clay and bamboo, a scroll on the wall with just one brushstroke, a single flower placed in such a way that it looked forgotten, but wasn't. You didn't come for the drink. You came for the moment. The host would bow first, softly, slowly, not to welcome, but to join you in the same space, as if saying, we are both here now. Nothing else matters. Everything had a rhythm, the way the ladle moved, the soft scrape of bamboo whisk against ceramic, the pour, the steam, the silence, and you watched, not to judge, but to see. To really see. The host didn't speak unless necessary, and if they did, it was about the season, the light, the way the tea powder looked against the black lacquer bowl. No one rushed. The tea wasn't gulped, it was received, lifted with two hands, turned slightly, to avoid drinking from the front, out of respect for the bowl's beauty. Then, one sip, two, maybe three, and done. The flavor was earthy, bitter, not sweetened, not softened. It asked you to be present with it, to meet it where it was. Outside, the world continued. The birds called. The wind moved the reeds, but in the tea room, time folded. Breath slowed, a kind of quiet wrapped around everything, not emptiness, but fullness without noise. Even clothing mattered. Muted tones, soft fabric, so that nothing distracted from the moment. The utensils were humble. A bowl, a whisk, a ladle, but they were treated like relics, cleaned before and after with reverence, as if they too carried memory. And perhaps they did. Some bowls were centuries old, cracked and repaired with gold. Wabi-sabi, they called it, the beauty in imperfection. A bowl, like a person, could be more beautiful for having been broken. The tea itself came from powdered green leaves, matcha, finely ground, almost weightless. A shade of green that didn't shout, but whispered of moss, of forest, of quiet. Things, and the guests. They came not to socialize, but to remember, to pause, to breathe. A samurai might attend after battle, a monk before prayer, a poet on a gray morning. In that room, all were equal. There were no ranks, only presence. Some hosts spent decades perfecting the ceremony, not to become perfect, but to become invisible, to let the ritual speak for itself, to let the guest feel seen without being watched. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. There was something holy in the quiet, not religious, but sacred all the same. Because in a world of constant motion, stillness becomes its own kind of prayer. The tea ceremony didn't erase sorrow. It held it, let it settle at the bottom of the bowl, then lifted it gently to the lips. A sip of reality, warm, bitter, true. And when the last cup was finished, when the whisk had been cleaned, the cloth folded, the door slid open again. The world had not changed, but you had. You stepped outside with quieter footsteps, softer eyes, a little more space inside your chest. And even as the breeze tugged at your sleeves and the sun filtered through pine needles above, you carried the silence with you, like a second heartbeat, like a companion, the kind of silence that teaches, the kind of silence that stays. And that brings us to those who sought silence more permanently, not in rooms, but in mountains, not in bowls, but in breath. The monks, who left the world not to escape it, but to sit beside it and listen. They did not leave the world in anger, nor in fear. They left with a bow, a soft step into the forest, into the fog, into the places where names dissolve and only breath remained. The mountain did not welcome them. It simply accepted. Mist curled around their ankles as they climbed, neither helping nor resisting. The trees did not speak, but they listened, and that was enough. These monks were not born into silence. They chose it. Some were once warriors, tired of blood. Some were nobles, tired of noise. Most were simply men, tired. And in that weariness, they found a kind of invitation to let go, to walk away from titles, from mirrors, from ambition, to trade silk for straw, walls for wind, voices for bells. Their temples were not grand, just wooden beams and cold stone, roofs that dripped in the rain, windows with no glass. Air moved freely, as did thought. They rose before the sun, not to conquer the day, but to greet it, to sit, to breathe, to do nothing with such deep intention that even the wind bowed in passing. There were chores, of course. The fire had to be stoked, the garden tended, the floor swept, but no task was lesser. To sweep was to meditate. To stir the pot was to nourish not just the body, but the silence around it. They walked barefoot in the snow, not to prove strength, but to remember what cold really felt like, to feel each flake as it melted against skin. A teacher, not an enemy. The fog would roll in some mornings so thick you could not see the monk in front of you, but you heard the bell. Its tone, deep, low, slow, was not a call to action, but a reminder. You are here. You are breathing. That is enough. Their robes were simple, rough cotton, dyed in dull browns and grays. Clothes that did not beg for attention, but offered anonymity, a chance to dissolve into the landscape, to belong to nothing but the moment. Meals were silent. One bowl, rice, maybe miso, maybe a few pickled vegetables, eaten slowly, with thanks, not in words, but in posture. They bowed to their food, to their spoon, to the empty space in front of them. Because all of it, the food, the cold, the silence, was part of the teaching. Asterisk, if you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some meditated, in caves, for days, for weeks, not to escape thought, but to meet it face to face, to sit beside it like an old companion and say, I see you. You may stay, or you may go. I will still be here. They grew thin, but not frail. Their strength did not come from muscle, but from stillness. A spine that did not sway in wind. A mind that did not panic when nothing happened. Visitors came sometimes, carrying questions, carrying grief, carrying the chaos of the lowlands in their voices. The monks did not offer answers. They offered tea and a place to sit. And sometimes, a poem, not to fix, just to share. The mountain fog comes. I lose the path for a while. But still, I breathe here. There were no sermons, only presence. The monks did not sell salvation. They embodied it, quietly, through every bow, every breath, every leaf swept from a step. Their joy was not loud. It was steady, the kind of joy found in knowing the fire will be warm again, that spring will return, that even the longest night ends, not with applause, but with a single bird call at dawn. When death came, they did not fear it. They bowed to it too, welcomed it as one welcomes a guest long expected. Some left poems, final ones, 5 lines, soft as fog, sharp as frost. Do not wait for me. The pine branch bows with snow now. Even in stillness, life moves through the quiet stream. Let the wind remember me. And then they were gone, returned not to legend, but to soil, to the place that held their silence, to the sky that never needed to speak to understand. And the bell rang once more, not in mourning, in acknowledgement that someone had lived, and lived well. And that brings us to a different kind of waiting, not for clarity, but for a man who left and the woman who stayed, whose life unfolded in a series of partings, and whose strength was measured not in battle, but in patience. She did not cry when he left. She bowed, hands pressed together, head low as the sound of his sandals faded down the narrow path behind their home. She stood until the dust settled, until even the wind stopped pretending he might turn back. This was the way. Men left, to fight, to serve, to climb mountains in search of gods, or glory, or simply to disappear for a while. And women, they stayed. They waited, not in idleness, in rhythm, in ritual, in repetition so familiar, it became its own kind of prayer. Each morning she lit the fire, kneeling beside the hearth, coaxing flames from last night's embers. She cooked the rice with the same hand that had once tied his sash. She swept the floors he once paced. She folded the robes he left behind. And with every motion, she remembered him. Not loudly, just in the way her fingers paused briefly on the edge of his sleeve. In the way she left the window open, just in case. In the way her eyes flickered toward the path, even when she wasn't looking for anything. She wore no armor, only layers of cotton and patience. Her strength was not forged in fire, but pressed into her spine by seasons of silence. Neighbors passed and bowed. Some asked if she had heard from him. Others didn't bother. They knew the answer. And still, she smiled, not because she was happy, but because it was what you did when life required grace. The seasons came and went. Spring brought the plum blossoms. She cut them carefully and placed them in a vase, not for herself, but for him, in case he returned. Brought heat, and she wiped her brow with the sleeve he once kissed. Autumn, the crunch of leaves beneath her sandals, the smell of smoke, the ache of another year turning, and winter. Winter, the season of waiting itself. When the wind slipped through the paper walls and pressed itself against her back like a reminder, you are alone, but not unloved. She wrote him letters, not to send, to fold, stacked carefully inside a wooden box, each one beginning the same. It was cold today. I wore the robe you left behind. Some days she imagined him reading them, not aloud, just slowly, like he used to drink tea with both hands, as if it might spill through the cracks in the world. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe. If you'd like more nights like this, she raised their children without drama. She didn't speak poorly of their father, didn't glamorize him either. She simply answered, he left because he had to, and one day he might return. And that was enough. For them, for her. Most days, there were nights, of course, when the house felt too quiet, when the wind sounded too much like footsteps, when she reached across the bed and found only cold, but she didn't weep, not where anyone could see. She would sit by the brazier, hands folded in her lap, and watch the coals fade, letting the silence speak, letting the stillness soothe. Others remarried. She did not because she was noble, but because she couldn't bear to fold another man's robes, couldn't bear to hear someone else's voice in that house, couldn't bear to explain her waiting. Some would call that foolish. She called it remembering. And in her remembering, she created something rare, a home where love lived, even in absence. Years passed. The path behind the house grew soft with moss. New trees grew where he had once walked, and she grew older, but not bitter. Her hair silvered, her knees stiffened, but her hands still folded his robe once a week, still swept the step, still lit the lantern by the door, just in case. And then, one evening, the lantern stayed lit a little longer, not because he returned, but because she was tired and didn't want the darkness to come too quickly. That night, she opened the box of letters. One by one, she unfolded them. She read them aloud, to the walls, to the tatami, to the shadows. And when she reached the last one, she smiled. Because, even though he never came back, she had never been alone. Not really. He had been in the fire she lit, in the robe she folded, in the tea she poured, in the silence that made space for her to breathe. Not to wait is not to suffer. It is to believe that what once was real remains real in memory, and that love, even distant, leaves footprints that never fade. And that brings us to the quiet domestic world they shared, in the warmth of a house made of paper and wood, where danger came not in sword strikes, but in winter drafts, and the daily dance between comfort and collapse. The house was not strong. It did not keep out the cold. It bent in the wind. It creaked like a tired elder and leaked in the rain like a forgotten story. But it was home got in ancient Japan. Most houses were built not for permanence, but for breathing. Made of wood and paper, of straw and soil. They were more like shelters. Of spirit than fortresses of stone. The walls were thin, just rice paper stretched across slender frames. They glowed in the morning, turned gold at sunset, and shivered in the winter wind. You could hear everything through them. A baby's breath, a whispered joke, the clink of chopsticks in a bowl 2 rooms away. The floor was made of tatami, woven straw mats with just enough give to soften a tired knee. If you sat long enough, they remembered your shape, soft, springy, and forever scented faintly with time. There were no chairs, no beds as we know them. People knelt, sat cross-legged, slept on futons that were unrolled at night and folded away each morning, a daily act of both discipline and humility. And the fire. The fire. It burned low in the center of the home. A sun beneath the roof, not always visible, but always present. It was not for show. It was survival. Cooked the rice, warmed the tea, and lit the faces gathered around it. Children dozed near its glow. Grandparents told quiet stories beside it. Ash settled like snow on the floor above it. The rafters darkened with soot. Years of meals, laughter, arguments, births, and silences woven into blackened wood. There was no privacy. Not in the way we understand it. A family lived as one, hearing each other's dreams, feeling each other's breath, sleeping side by side, hearts beating like a soft drum beneath the shared roof. When one person sighed, the others listened. Not always out of concern. Sometimes just out of closeness. The door was a wooden panel, sliding open to the world outside, to snow, to sun, to chickens, to neighbors with gossip or miso. And still, they swept. Each morning, the step was brushed clean, even if the wind came right after and scattered leaves again. Cleanliness was not about conquest. It was about rhythm, order, a way to say, today we begin again. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The kitchen was not separate. It was part of the life breath of the house. You could hear the pot lid rattling as rice steamed. You could smell the dashi stock before it reached a boil. You knew someone was home, not because you saw them, but because you could smell them cooking. There were holes in the walls, sometimes cracks, wood that had split from too many summers. But nothing was ever thrown away quickly. A sliding door that groaned was oiled, not replaced. A cup with a chip was still used, just turned slightly in the hand. The idea was not perfection. It was presence. Even insects had a place. A cricket, chirping in a corner, might be left undisturbed. Its song, a companion. A reminder that the house was not sealed off from the world, but part of it when storms came. The paper shuddered. The walls moved, but the people didn't panic. They listened, adjusted the shutters, moved their bedding away from the draft. If the roof leaked, someone fetched a bucket. Not with anger, with familiarity. As if the house itself were alive and simply having a bad day. There was pride in the small things. A shelf hung straight. A pot that boiled without boiling over. The scent of cedar after scrubbing the floor. Life didn't demand much. Just care, just attention. And when night came, candles were lit. The shadows danced behind the paper walls. And the fire hissed its lullaby. Sleep was not silent. It came with the sound of wind through bamboo, a child murmuring in dreams, an old man's breath slowing beside his wife of many decades. The house wrapped them all, not in insulation, but in memory. They didn't live in fear of collapse. They lived in trust of daily repair. The same hand that brushed rice from a child's chin also patched the hole in the wall. The same hand that bowed to the sun each morning also turned the fish on the fire. And so the house endured. Not because it was built to last, but because it was loved. Because every creak, every stain, every threadbare mat told the story of a family asterisk that had not left, had not fled, had stayed through the cold, through the rain, through the soft ache of time. And that brings us to a darker corner of their world, not made of paper, but of pride. A ritual not for the living, but for how to die with grace when the weight of failure grew too heavy to bear. It did not begin with rage, nor with shame shouted in the streets. It began with silence, with a bow, with a room swept clean and a robe tied just right. In ancient Japan, there was a way to die that was not escape, but expression. Not surrender, but sentence. It was called seppuku, and it was many things. A ritual, a reckoning, a poem composed with the body, in blood instead of ink. But more than that, it was the art of waiting to die, with dignity sharpened like the blade that would carry it out. The man preparing for it didn't cry. He combed his hair, he burned. Incense. He chose his words, his clothing, and the room in which he would leave the world, not in fear, in form. Because even in death, there was an order to things. He ate a final meal, but never too much. There was no comfort in overindulgence. Just enough rice, a sip of water, sometimes sake, and silence. He did not rush. He knelt before the small table. He wrote a poem, not about dying, but about what he had seen. the moon through pine branches, the way cherry blossoms fell without asking why, the feel of rain against a child's hand. A life, distilled dot then, the robe, white, the color, of death, of purity, of return. His sword was not long, only as long as needed, short, precise like the act itself, and someone would be there. A second, a friend, a brother, a trusted soul whose hands were steady and heart just strong enough to end it before the suffering grew too deep dot, because seppuku was not just about death, it was about control, about saying, you may take my life, but I decide how. There was no audience, no applause, just the quiet scrape of steel, the sharp breath before the cut, and the final clean mercy of the blade that followed dot. To us, perhaps, it seems unthinkable. To choose pain, to choose stillness when one could run. But to them, it was the final proof of character, the ultimate reply to shame. A sentence written in the only ink left when all else was gone. There were no sobbing relatives, no mourning. Wails. The room remained calm. The walls heard it all and held it. Afterward, the body was cleaned, dressed again, the blood wiped away with hands that had known him in life. There was no dishonor in the body, only completion, if you're still settling in. Maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only, if it feels right. Some who witnessed it never forgot the sound of it, not the steel, but the silence. A silence so full, it pressed against the skin. A silence that said, this was not tragedy. This was choice. The scrolls do not always write their names. Many who chose this path did so without fame, without glory. Farmers turned soldiers, sons who failed their fathers, commanders who lost battles but kept their honor. And some were told to do it, commanded, given no other way out. Even then, they met it the same way, with posture, with presence, with the quiet knowledge that, though the world may decide their fate, they would decide the shape of their end. And when the ashes cooled, when the tatami was replaced, and the incense drifted through the house once more, there was no loud grief, only the placing of a name on a family altar, only a poem left unfinished, because in seppuku, nothing was wasted. Not the pain, not the time, not the love dot. It was not about giving up. It was about giving everything, even the end, its proper shape. Even today, the stories remain, whispered more than spoken, taught in the way elders pause at certain topics, in the way a name is spoken with extra softness, in the way a poem is folded with care, because seppuku was never about death. It was about life held tightly until the very last second, then released with grace. And that brings us to those who witnessed all of this with wide, quiet eyes, the children who played in the shadows, learned from whispers, and grew up faster than they were ready to. They were always watching, not seen, but watching, tucked behind paper walls, beneath tables, inside doorframes wide enough to fit a child's wonder, but too small for a grown-up's concern. In ancient Japan, childhood was not a time of noise. It was a time of learning, of listening, of waiting in the shadows until the world made room for you. No one explained the rules out loud. They were absorbed, from glances exchanged over meals, from the way a mother smoothed the crease of a robe, from the silence that followed a father's sigh. Children knew when to bow. They learned when to speak, and when not to. They learned to walk softly, to handle cups with two hands, to kneel straight even when their knees ached. There were no toys in the way we know them. A pinnacone was a doll, a smooth stone, a treasure. A folded scrap of paper could become a crane, a helmet, a secret. Laughter wasn't forbidden, but it was quiet. A burst, then a glance toward the door. Did anyone hear? They played in narrow alleys, in fields just beyond the rice paddies, in the garden when the grown-ups weren't watching. They chased insects, watched frogs, built castles of mud that would never be spoken of again after the sun set. When they came home, they washed their feet, their hands, their voices. They sat beside their parents during meals, never first, rarely last. And if they were lucky, someone would slip them an extra radish, a bit of fish skin, a corner of something sweet. Learned by copying. How to stir the pot, how to tie a sash, how to sweep a floor without missing the corners. Their chores came early. Feeding chickens, carrying water, folding bedding. Some grumbled, most did not, because the house was not a place to be served. It was a place to serve. And when someone cried, they weren't told to stop. They were told to finish quietly, to let the tears fall like rain. Useful, cleansing, brief. Sometimes children watched their fathers leave, with packs on their backs and words they didn't understand. And sometimes they didn't come back. The questions were rarely asked aloud. Only eyes turned toward the path. Only dreams whispered the shape of an answer. They studied too, not in grand halls, but at low tables lit by daylight. A brush, ink, paper that crinkled under unsure fingers. They practiced characters over and over, their names and poems, then the words of their ancestors. And when they got one right, no applause. Just a nod. Maybe, if the day was generous, a soft, well done. That was enough. Girls were taught how to cook, how to serve tea, how to walk without showing their feet. They knew which flowers bloomed first. They memorized the seasons like prayers. They learned to read faces before they could read books. Boys learned to hold tools, to mend thatch, to sit still while a father spoke. Some were taught the sword, most how to bow to it. They didn't ask what they would be when they grew up. They already knew, a version of their parents, but with better posture, fewer mistakes, more silence. Yet even within the rules, they found wonder. The steam rising from miso soup was a cloud to be studied. The way a dragonfly hovered was magic. The first snow was not inconvenience. It was joy in white. A chance to run, to fall, to press their hands into the soft edge of the season. And they did run, sometimes, when no one was looking, barefoot, through puddles, mud flying, hair loose. Laughter like music they weren't supposed to hear. Then the cleanup, the straightening, the return to the world that didn't always see them, but they were always watching, learning, noticing when a voice trembled, when a smile was too fast. A read between words. They remembered, if you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some carried grief too young, a sibling lost to illness, a parent who vanished with war. And still they woke. Still they bowed. Still they swept. Because in that time, even the smallest child understood. Life was not guaranteed. Warmth was a gift. And growing up meant knowing how to hold both joy and sorrow in the same small hands. And when they finally became adults, they didn't speak often of their childhood, but they remembered the smell of tatami in summer, the way their mother's hands felt when combing their hair, the sound of rain on a paper wall, the warmth of a stolen snack beside the fire, memories folded neatly like letters never sent. That brings us to those who never had enough, of rice, of money, of rest, but carried themselves with grace anyway, finding humor in hardship and dignity in cracked bowls. They rose before the sun, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The world did not wait for the poor, and in ancient Japan, being poor was not a label. It was a rhythm, a quiet beat beneath everything else. They were fishermen, farmers, hoarders, potters. Their names were rarely written, but their hands were on everything. The bowls that nobles ate from, the roofs that kept the rain out, the roads that others traveled. They were the background, but they were the pulse. Their homes were narrow, wood and mud, straw and resolve. The walls leaned, the roofs sagged. But inside, you could hear laughter. Not constant, not loud, but real. They knew how to make something from nothing. A stew from scraps, a song from sorrow, a joke from a broken sandal. Their dignity wasn't in what they had. It was in how they moved, how they carried buckets without spilling, how they kept their children clean even when the floor was dirt, how they bowed to the sunrise as if it were royalty. The sound of their lives was not music, but rhythm. Chop, stir, sweep, haul, the thump of feet on packed earth, the creak of a cart loaded too high, the soft grunt of lifting one more bundle than the body said it could. They did not complain loudly. There was no point, but they did speak. At the well, at the riverbank, beside the fire, they spoke in proverbs, in sideways glances, in laughter that said, "Yes, this is hard, but here we are." Children were not spared. They worked too, but they also played, with string, with stones. With each other, they chased shadows across rice fields, turned chores into games. They knew that joy didn't wait for wealth. It waited for permission, and they gave it freely. Meals were small, a scoop of rice, pickled radish, a slice of fish if the river had been kind, but the bowls were passed with care. Chopsticks clicked politely, and no grain was wasted. Rice was more than food. It was effort, memory. A promise in every bite. Evening was their gift. Work ended. Fire crackled. Children leaned against parents. And the day's silence turned to soft chutter. Stories were told. Of animals that tricked gods. Of neighbors who talked too much. Of times when things were worse, and somehow better. They laughed, not to forget, but to forgive themselves, the world. The ache in their knees. They bathed together in wooden tubs, not for luxury, but for relief. Steam rising, skin loosening. Wounds whispered to the water and left there. They didn't expect rest, but when it came, they held it tightly. A good night's sleep was a treasure, a warm blanket, a fortune, a kind word at dusk, a crown. When someone died, they were mourned without grandeur. A neighbor would take the shovel. Another would bring food. Grief was not a ceremony. It was a shared silence. A bowl placed where they used to sit. A name whispered as incense curled upward. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. And still, they celebrated. Not in palaces, but with lanterns made from old paper, with dances in bare feet, with drums that thudded like heartbeats, with clothes mended twice, worn with pride. They knew the seasons by smell, knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to pray for rain, when to be thankful it didn't come. They watched the moon not for romance, but for tides, for time, for a moment to stand still, look up, and remember that the sky had room for them to. And in all of it, the dirt, the heat, the hunger, they carried themselves, not like victims, not like heroes, just like people who didn't ask for much, just a roof, a meal, a bit of peace at the end of a long day. And sometimes, when the wind was soft and the fire burned just right, they'd hum old songs, not with skill, but with memory, because dignity has a sound. It's not loud. It doesn't beg. It simply says, I am still here. I am still me. And that brings us to a quieter corner still, where voices softened even more, where secrets floated downstream, and where women gathered to speak without. Speaking at the edge of the river that carried both sorrow and song. The river did not rush. It moved with the grace of someone who had seen everything and needed to tell no one. It curved gently past fields and forests, through villages with thatched roofs and steaming rice pots, never hurrying, never forgetting that at dawn, the women came. Not in groups, not always, sometimes alone, sometimes 2 or 3, walking barefoot. Across the dew-wet grass, wooden buckets in hand, laundry balanced on their hips. The river was not a place of ceremony, but it was sacred, not because it had been blessed, but because it listened. There, at the water's edge, beneath willows and bending reeds, the women lowered their burdens. Not just clothes, not just buckets, but the weight of everything they couldn't say at home. They knelt beside smooth stones worn down by centuries of repetition, wrung cloth in silence, scrubbed out the stubbornness of stains, the mud of yesterdays, shoes, the soot of a week's worth of cooking. And as they worked, they spoke, not loudly, not always in full sentences, but in tones that carried. He hasn't written since the last harvest. She's been coughing at night. The neighbor boy was caught stealing fish again. Their words floated just above the rippling surface, then fell gently in, not to vanish, but to be carried. The river didn't judge. It just moved. Children played upstream, splashing, shouting, as mothers called out warnings softened with love. Old women, their hair gray and braided, worked slowly, carefully. Their hands knew every fold in the fabric, every ache in the joints, every secret that could not be spoken at dinner. They talked about husbands who drank too much, daughters growing into silence, food prices that had climbed again, the ache in their backs that never quite left. But even in the heavy words, there was laughter. Not the laughter of jokes, the laughter of recognition, of me too, of I know, of I'm still here. Sometimes no one spoke at all. They just scrubbed, watched the water, let the sun rise without comment. The silence between them as warm as steam. They'd bring fish, sometimes, caught early, still twitching, washed with the same hands that would later salt and grill them, and flowers, plucked from riverbanks, tucked behind ears or pressed into little girls' palms. If you listened long enough, you'd hear more than words. The splash of cloth against rock, the slap of wet sleeves wrung twice, the soft grunt of lifting a full bucket, and beneath it all, the sigh of the river, accepting everything. When one of them wept, and it did happen, the others didn't rush, didn't console with platitudes. They moved closer, kept scrubbing, let the rhythm of shared labor speak louder than comfort. Sometimes they sang, old songs half remembered, handed down like recipes. One voice would start, another would hum along, and soon the melody drifted between the reeds, gentler than wind. When a woman disappeared from the river, too sick to come, too old to walk, gone from the world altogether, her absence echoed. The stones she used, the place she knelt, the scarf she always wore. Someone else would take her place, but never quite. The river remembered her, and so did they. They washed more than clothes. They washed fear, guilt, exhaustion, hope. They washed the days off their skin and made room for the next one. And when the sun climbed higher, when the fish stopped biting and the children's feet turned pruny in the cold, they rose, gathered damp linens, tied their bundles, and walked home slowly, not lighter, but less alone. The water kept moving, carrying their voices downstream to other women, other stones, other mornings. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Even now, you can imagine them. Not as figures in paintings, not as stories in books, but as mothers, sisters, friends, holding the weight of family in one hand and a dripping rag in the other. They weren't remarkable, except that they were, and the river, the one that never stopped, held their stories better than any scroll, because it understood some truths are too heavy to carry alone. And some mornings, the simple act of scrubbing a sleeve is a kind of salvation. And that brings us to the nights that followed, when lanterns were lit, wood creaked beneath sandals, and the warmth of shared silence gave way to the glow of small lights flickering like stars here on Earth. Rain didn't interrupt life in ancient Japan. It accompanied it, falling soft as breath over thatched roofs, trickling through bamboo gutters, gathering in puddles that mirrored a sky forever turning. And when it rained, the world glowed, not brightly, not boldly, but with the soft shimmer of lanterns, tiny moons tucked into corners of the night, each one swaying slightly, as if nodding to passers-by. They were made from paper and wood, fragile things, flames held inside folded silence. Their frames bent in wind, their light flickered in protest, but they endured. At dusk, they were lit one by shopkeepers brushing dust from doorframes, by children running errands in wooden sandals, by old men who lit them the same way every night, as if calling the evening home. The rain clicked gently against cobblestones, not a storm, just a reminder that even the sky had days it needed to cry. And beneath the dripping eaves, people moved slowly, hats of straw tilted just so. Robes pulled tight, sandals lifting and setting down without hurry. They weren't escaping the rain. They were walking with it, sharing the street like a guest you didn't quite invite, but couldn't turn away. Lanterns lit the way. Shadows danced across shop walls. Rice vendors, carpenters, tea houses whispering steam into the mist. A samurai passed silently, his sword hidden beneath his cloak. A mother carried her sleeping child wrapped in oilcloth. A monk stepped over a puddle without breaking rhythm. Even the dogs moved quieter. Homes were aglow with warmth. Through paper walls, you could see silhouettes. A woman stirring soup, a child learning calligraphy, a man mending a broken sandal by lamplight. Nothing loud, nothing urgent, just lives unfolding gently under the weight of water and time. If you stopped and listened, you could hear the song of it all, the soft splash of a passing cart, the drip of rain from rooftop edges, the distant chime of wind bells, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to remind you the air was still moving. The lanterns flickered on. Inside tea houses, voices murmured over cups of green warmth. Not laughter, but something close. A warmth made richer by the sound of rain on roof tiles. A poet might sit alone by the window, watching drops race each other down the glass. Not writing, just thinking. Some nights didn't need words, just tea and rain and light. In alleyways, puddles reflected everything, lanterns doubling themselves in ripple and gold. Children reached out to touch them, only to scatter the illusion, and laughed. Because even in the rain, joy found its way in, through cracks in the night, through the hiss of grilled fish over coals, through the gentle shuffle of slippers on wet stone. The night did not ask for perfection. It asked for presence. And people gave it, by stepping outside even when their sleeves might get wet, by nodding to neighbors under umbrellas of oiled paper, by walking a little slower, not because of the rain, but because the world felt more delicate when wet. And the lanterns. Oh, the lanterns. They did not try to outshine the darkness. They honored it. Their glow didn't conquer. It comforted. Each one a small refusal to vanish. Each one a quiet statement. We are still here, still glowing, still moving through the night. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Even after midnight, they burned in windows at temple gates, hung from trees like paper fruit. And when the rain finally slowed, and the sky turned from ink to pearl, some lanterns had gone out, but most were still flickering. Tired, perhaps, but loyal. The city, the village, the little world breathed in, breathed out. Another night had passed, wrapped in damp wood, the scent of earth, and the kindness of light. And when morning came, the lanterns were taken down. Embers emptied, wicks set aside, paper dried in sunbeams, creeping across the floor until dusk returned. And hands, steady from repetition, licked them again, one by one, the same ritual, the same rhythm, because some things are worth repeating, especially on rainy nights. And that brings us to the stories they told to pass the longest hours, not to scare, but to understand fear, to give shape to the strange, and to remind children and adults that even shadows have names. In the quiet hours after lanterns dimmed, when the world was wrapped in silk shadows, and only the soft rustle of paper screens could be heard, there were stories whispered in hushed voices, passed from mother to child, from neighbor to neighbor, not to frighten, but to teach. They were the tales of yokai, spirits, ghosts, creatures that lived just beyond sight, in the spaces where the wind bent and the moonlight faltered. Some were mischievous, tricksters who would tie a traveler's sandals, or mimic voices to lead the lost astray. Others were sorrowful, lonely souls trapped between worlds, waiting for a prayer, a remembered name, a flicker of kindness. A grandmother might tell you of the Zashiki Warashi, a child spirit who lived in tatami rooms, bringing luck to those who noticed the soft footsteps and mischief to those who did not. Or the kappa, water dwellers with beaked faces, who lurked in rivers and ponds, pulling unsuspecting children beneath the surface. But they could be appeased with cucumbers left. At the river's edge, a quiet offering of peace, the stories were never just stories. They were warnings, lessons wrapped in mystery. How to respect the land, how to respect the unseen, how to walk carefully between worlds. If you listened carefully, you could hear them in the creak of floorboards, in the sigh of sliding doors, in the sudden chill that passed through a room. Fear was not about monsters. It was about what happens when respect is forgotten, when silence is broken carelessly, when pride blinds the heart. Children were taught to speak softly at night, to avoid waking the tengu, bird-like creatures with red faces, known to punish. Arrogance, to never ridicule the yurei, restless spirits who carried regrets too heavy to let go. And so, bedtime became a sacred time, not just for rest, but for reflection, for remembering the thin line between the living and the dead. Families, gathered close, wrapped in blankets and stories, the glow of a single candle flickering against the walls, as voices wove threads of caution and comfort. Sometimes, the oldest among them would share a tale of their own encounter with the unseen, a shadow that lingered too long, a whisper in the dark, a dream that was more than a dream. These were not ghost stories for thrills. They were gentle reminders that the world is full of mystery, of respect, of things we cannot explain but must honor. And in that honoring, there was safety, peace, a way to walk through the night with steady feet and open eyes. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Because sometimes the greatest comfort comes from knowing you are never truly alone, that the past is always near, whispering behind sliding doors, watching, waiting, in the hush between heartbeats. And that brings us to a world shaped not by fear, but by beauty. Gardens tended like prayers, stones placed with care and silence, grown into art. A garden is not just a collection of plants. It is a breath held in the earth, a quiet conversation between stone, leaf, and sky dot in ancient Japan, gardens were more than decoration. They were living poems, crafted with intention, shaped with reverence, and tended with patience. Paths wound like rivers of stone, bridges arched gently over still pools, their surfaces mirroring clouds, leaves, the fleeting sky. Every rock placed not by chance, but with meaning, a reminder of mountains, of islands, of the spaces between. Moss grew thick like velvet, softening the hard edges, a green silence that invited stillness. Water trickled quietly, not rushing, but lingering like a whispered secret. The gardeners worked slowly, their hands moving with care, each pruning a meditation, each sweep of the broom a gesture of respect. There was no hurry, no need to conquer nature, only to partner with it. Garden asked nothing, but gave everything. A place to breathe, to reflect, to be small. Visitors entered with reverence, feet soundless on gravel paths, eyes tracing the gentle arc of a tree, the delicate bloom of a cherry flower. They sat on wooden benches, listening to the soft drip of water from bamboo spouts, watching koi fish glide like living brushstrokes beneath the surface. Even in winter, when snow dusted the pines and bamboo, the garden was alive, its silence deeper, its beauty austere and profound. Here, the world's worries seemed to pause. The rush of daily life held at bay. And in that pause, a space opened, for healing, for peace, for awe. The garden did not complain about the cold. It embraced it, each fallen leaf a testament to change, each bare branch a promise of spring. They understood that life was like the garden, fragile, ephemeral, but always ready to renew itself. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. A gardener's work was never done. Every day brought new growth, new decay, new chance, and every step through the garden was a step inward, into silence, into stillness, into a kind of gentle surrender. There was beauty in patience, in waiting, in the knowing that even the smallest stone, the quietest pool, held worlds within. And when visitors left, they carried the garden with them, not in their hands, but in their breath, in the way their shoulders relaxed, in the softening of their gaze. The garden was not just a place. It was a teacher, a refuge, a memory. And that brings us to the final days of a warrior's life, not in battle, but in reflection, as the sun sets behind the mountains and a blade is laid down, gently for the last time.